Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, CMC, as well as pharmacovigilance. We offer three different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I'm going to be speaking with one of our consultants, Derek Wessman out of Japan. Derek, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right, awesome. So would you start us off by introducing yourself and your background and then explain to the audience what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. My name's Derek Wessman. I have been here in Japan since 2004. Since 2009, I've run a company here in Japan that provides Japanese companies with help navigating regulatory hurdles, FDA inspections, applications, and all other, kind of aspects of compliance. Also help companies do supplier audits of companies in Japan who they need to go and give audits to. Um, we help with both pharma as well as medical device and combination products, and also ISO 9001, ISO 13485, depending on the situation. Uh, so that's kind of just the quick rundown. Today we'll kind of talk about some aspects of those things, I think, and whatever else you're interested in.
Yeah, sure. So it sounds like it's going to be Japanese centric and I would say auditing centric. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Uh-huh.
Okay. Well, why don't you kind of kick us off and tell me a little bit about kind of where, kind of we talked before we hit record, we're going to start kind of elementary and then kind of graduate into some of the more esoteric aspects of auditing Japan. So
Yeah.
why don't you kind of give us a foundation to start from?
Right. I mean, so obviously, Japan's just another market in the normal sense of doing, life science business. But there are some aspects that are a little bit unique. There's a bigger language barrier than probably with most other countries. And there's also, because Japan has been the second or third largest, life science market, depending on how you segment it. It's been pretty insular depending on the company. A lot of companies in Japan have just done business with Japan.
Mm.
And so when they have to do business with an overseas from them client or supplier or regulatory body or notified body, etc., there can be some hurdles. There can be some cultural translation that needs to happen,
Mm.
things like that. And so, obviously, it's also far from a lot of our clients who are overseas, and so there's that distance. Even in today's age, that does tend to matter.
Yeah.
So those are some of the basics, but getting those companies help at complying, making sure that the companies that use Japanese suppliers are covering their bases in terms of regulatory requirements is often something that companies run into difficulty doing.
Well, let's start there. So
Hmm.
I'm a company and I'm utilizing a supplier in Japan.
Hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the challenges that they can expect to encounter and maybe even kind of enter into some of the actions they can take to overcome those challenges?
Yeah. First off, the physical distance definitely is something that companies have to take into account. You've got to send an audit team over if you want to, for example, do a supplier audit. Let's say you have a critical API supplier, or you have an OEM manufacturer of injection needles. That sort of an audit, you have to consider not only the distance and making sure that you get your team over there, which is a cost. You're also going to arrive at the site, and nobody might, in many cases, nobody will speak English. So,
Mm,
are you bringing interpreters? Are they supplying interpreters?
mm, yeah.
Um, if you have scheduled a day-long audit, which is, common, I think, with a supplier audit, and you have an interpreter who is, interpreting for you, they are hopefully proficient. Sometimes interpreters get hired from interpreting agencies and don't know anything about life science or
Oh,
about
yeah.
regulatory rules. And then you're translating not only between languages but between fields.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
If you have an interpreter, you're also immediately half or less time than you expected to have. If you were thinking you had a day, now you have a half day because everything you say, you have to stop and wait for the interpreter to say it again.
Right.
Hopefully in a concise way, but you never know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can certainly understand that because I'm fluent in Portuguese, and I
Ah.
would never want to be an interpreter for an audit because that is where my Portuguese stops. I don't I don't know how to say centrifuge in Portuguese. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the distance and the translation is an issue. You know, kind of thinking, if there was a partner that had resources that were local, that obviously cuts down on the travel time and the cost. Also, if you have somebody that's local, that's familiar, fluent in Japanese, and also understands the regulations, that's a huge leg up. So,
Yes.
I can kind of see where resources like yourself and the FDA group could really, really come into play. So, how have you seen companies typically deal with these challenges? Have they, I mean, it's on its face, it might seem obvious as to how you fix it, right? But, can you maybe, provide some color into companies that handled it the wrong way and companies that handled it the right way?
Right. I mean, the default is to throw money at the problem. You pay a lot of money to fly everybody over. You pay for interpreters, and good interpreters cost money because they're worth it. You throw time at it. Again, you have to spend double the time to get the same amount of auditing done. So in the just default, don't have another solution case, the company just has to pay it if they want to get that audit done correctly. The way that companies can get around it is using a firm such as the FDA Group that has resources on the ground in the place, and immediately that is going to eliminate the need for transoceanic travel, for example.
Hmm.
If they have the language ability, again, you don't have to have an interpreter potentially. It's been really helpful in my experience, and I end up tooting my own horn, but if I can go into a place and they see my face, but when I walk in and start speaking to them in Japanese and I'm speaking FDA to them
Mm.
or I'm speaking ISO to them, that's a double. Oh, this is, oh, good. We don't have
Yeah.
to get over that hurdle. The auditee is really happy about that.
Yeah.
Wait, we can just show you our quality manual in Japanese. We can just show you our CAPA procedure. We can just show you the CAPA file and you can just read it.
Yeah.
Wow, okay, great. But at the same time, for the auditor client side, they're happy because I can look at the documents. There's no language barrier to be able to say hide any problems. Nothing can be swept under the rug. We can see what's going on immediately. And I'm doing all of that in Japanese at the site, but I'm writing the audit report in English for the client. And so there's just zero friction there between cultures and language that people really love.
Mm.
in my experience, and that solves a lot of the aforementioned transoceanic travel and time and interpreter cost and all of those things.
Yeah. I want to, because when I think about suppliers in Japan, you talk about some of the challenges you got to overcome. There's the language barrier, there's the distance. So I do want to ask you, for those people that, I mean, if people are already using suppliers, they probably understand some of the strengths and weaknesses, but then I'm sure there's other companies that might be considering Japan. And so I want you to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Japan. But
Hmm.
before you do, really, intrigued by cultural differences. So before we jump into that, could you share some of kind of the 101s in terms of Japanese culture and something that, someone like myself that's never been there would say, "Oh, that's an interesting cultural difference. I didn't know that."
Yeah, sure. First off, I mean, whenever you talk about cultural differences, I think it's easy to get too far down the road of people being different or generalizing too much. I always say this, and it's such an obvious statement, but it is important. Japanese people are human beings, it turns out, and so um, the reason I say that is, there are a lot of I wouldn't say stereotypes because that's really, really negative, but there are a lot of conceptions I think people have about
Misconceptions.
Japan, right? Yeah, misconceptions. There are good people over here, bad people over here, honest people, dishonest people. People are humans, you know?
Hmm.
But what you'll see typically at a Japanese company, for example, that you wouldn't expect as much in the US or Europe is very long-term employees, for example.
Mm.
Companies here tend to see far less turnover of employees, which is good for the company in some ways, but it also can make a company very insular and
Mm.
unique in its approach to quality and to regulatory compliance. So a company might just have its really weird MO in some area. They might have, in a lot of cases, you'll still see companies hesitate to open a lot of kappas because a kappa is, corrective action, preventive action is a sign that you failed. That can sometimes be the culture still in some companies. You might run into cultural barriers where a person um, is is hesitant to throw another employee's work under the bus. And so for example, if a kappa, if I say, this kappa didn't really get to the root cause, and so I don't feel like the activities that you did were really effective to remove that root cause or to identify it in the first place. A person might hesitate to really agree, and we can't proceed much further because somebody else did the kappa and they don't want that person to be embarrassed.
Mm.
um there are a lot of things like that. And I would just say, another one that's really big that matters quite a lot, especially with FDA's focus on data integrity, is systems are often based on the assumption that everybody involved is honest. And so you might run into part four requirement problems where a company has everybody logging in on the same
Part
lab
11.
computer. Sorry. Yeah, part
Yeah.
11.
Hmm.
No, it's too early in the morning, I suppose. They also run into part four requirement problems too, with combination products. But part 11, yeah, a company might trust its employees too much. In other words, for the regulatory body to really accept systems.
Mm.
Everybody's logging in with the same account and password. That kind of
That's
a
a
thing
that's a
still exists
no-no.
more. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
big no-no, and you say, well, you can't do that because you can't have an audit trail that actually says who did what when, and there's a little bit more of a collective mindset here where it's like, hey, we did it. Who cares who did it? We did it.
Yeah.
That sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but and that's not to say that companies are are fools. They understand the rules for the most part, but there can just be every once in a while that kind of a situation.
Okay.
And you have to say to them, well, actually, there have been incidents where Japanese companies have falsified, testing results and things. It's not a foreign thing to your country or any country now.
Hmm.
That has to be explained sometimes.
Yeah.
So these kinds of things happen.
Okay. Fascinating. Thank you.
Hmm.
So let's move into the part two, strengths and weaknesses of Japanese suppliers.
Hmm.
I can see obviously one, which is that lack of turnover.
Hmm.
I would imagine that right off the bat, you're going to get some pretty good meetings and things getting set up, and then not having to be overly concerned with that mid-project turnover
Hmm.
where, they have to contact you and say, so and so is no longer here, but don't worry because we've got another person and they're awesome, right? So why don't you educate me
Hmm.
on that?
Yeah, exactly. That turnover piece can be really helpful because often if you, as I do in many cases, end up auditing the same company multiple times, it's sometimes the same people for 10 years. Every year, you're back with Tanaka-san, who is still, management representative, still, head of QA. That sort of thing happens. Um, you'll often find that clean, well-organized facilities, companies. So this is beyond just the turnover piece, but companies here are pretty strong about keeping things. They say 5S. Have safety, well-organized facilities, etc. That's really common. Quality is a focus, even just beyond the regulatory compliance side. There's a pride in quality that's really nice. A ton of companies here have ISO certification, so the basic principles are there in many cases. Even very small companies, around 2000, the year 2000 and beyond, started to get ISO certified, and so that can be really good. You'll often see FDA investigators come on a trip, and they'll go to China, they'll go to Korea, they'll go to Japan. Even it doesn't happen as much now, but they used to do that on just one trip, even.
Hmm.
And often they would say that they found the facilities to be just really well organized and clean, and that always makes a really good impression, obviously. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, so how often does FDA and other regulatory agencies go and conduct inspections in Japan?
Yeah, clearly it is, I think, less frequent than if the company was located in the US. It's obviously more of a hurdle internally, I think, for FDA to schedule and get investigators out to Japan. My experience with device companies is when if you discount COVID, which of course prevented any almost inspections from happening, maybe every 3, 4, even 5 years, if it's not a high risk or high problem, company.
Facility. Yeah.
Exactly. With pharma, it maybe it's a little more frequent, especially, again, risk-based, but I would say a little closer to the stated every 2 years, routine inspection schedule. But it actually kind of companies feel sort of on edge because there isn't a cadence as much, I think, as what some American companies might experience. In other words, FDA might not come for 8 years, and then they might come every 2 years for a while. It can be really hard to predict, and so you kind of just have to be always ready, as you should be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That sounds quite similar to the United States.
yeah.
So it sounds like there is a little bit of consistency there.
Okay, good.
which is
The
a
the
pro.
inconsistency is consistent, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which
Yeah.
actually is a great segue to my next question is when the FDA conducts an inspection in the United States, is it the same as when they do it in Japan plus the translator, or is it different?
It's it's way different from what I understand.
Okay.
I've only done FDA inspections in Japan or Vietnam or China when companies have operations in those countries. I've actually not been to a pure FDA inspection in the States that didn't have a Japan aspect to it. So the biggest and by far most impactful, let's say, aspect is the time frame. The investigator has to go home. They have a hard stop. They have a flight to catch. Whereas from my understanding of a U.S. facility, if things go bad or things need to be, checked, it can go on and on.
That's true.
Uh, right. And
Yep.
so the limited time is a massive factor. And then you put on top of that the fact that interpretation is going to take away at least half of the time. So a medical device inspection of a Japanese medical device facility is going to be scheduled for 4 days, Monday through Thursday, usually. And the investigator is going to have 2 days to work with, essentially.
Hmm.
So that's gonna drastically reduce what they can look at, and they'll just have to go straight to the highest risk, highest importance items, and never get to some others.
Speaking of that,
Yeah.
I know data integrity is important to FDA, but during an inspection, there's a pretty strong focus in CAPA complaints handling. What are and you actually did mention this earlier on, where people are a little less hesitant to create a CAPA because that's perceived as a failure.
Mhm.
So does that situation arise in an FDA inspection, and what other areas might be uncovered in an FDA inspection that's a little bit more common in Japan than it might be elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly, we run into that situation where something should have been a kappa and it wasn't. Companies often have, and this probably occurs in the US too, but I think it maybe is more common that here you'll have these little backwater systems created so that you don't have to do a kappa, which are of course,
Retrain the trainer.
oh yeah, there's
I mean,
retraining
yeah,
is,
yeah, retraining.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, retraining's always one that you hope not to see in the kappa as the main thing that was done to remove the root cause, right?
Hmm.
But also, you'll have things where we have an internal audit procedure, and that procedure includes a whole process that is equivalent to kappa, but we don't call it a kappa. So
Hmm.
when FDA asks for your kappa list, it's not on there. That's a problem that definitely occurs. Uh, there are some other things that you see, I think, a little more frequently here. As I mentioned with data integrity, you run into communal logins, communal passwords, communal results, a ton of Excel files being used to calculate test results that haven't been validated, that aren't necessarily locked, that aren't placed in a protected folder or whatever.
Hmm.
There's a general also, I think, hesitancy of Japanese companies to adopt expensive software
Hmm.
that would create the data integrity, the Part 11 compliance easily because the cost is too much of a hurdle for the
Hmm.
management. And so you often run into problems that if FDA were to really drill down, they would find that there are insufficient resources being provided by management.
Oh, okay.
So that's something that you have to always be talking to companies in advance and just regularly about. Say you need to give the right resources here, and I promise this will save you money in the long run. That sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really common.
When evaluating suppliers and who gets selected, a very simple way of doing it is price, quality, speed, pick two, right?
Mm.
So if I think about a Japanese supplier, can you comment on what a US company that's considering a Japanese supplier could expect to see from a price, quality, and speed standpoint?
Right. I mean, I think that often it'll be price and quality, and speed will be the one that gets sacrificed.
Mm,
Um, Organizations in Japan in general tend to focus a little more on getting internal consensus and
mm,
feeling like they have their ducks in a row prior to proceeding with a project or proceeding to the next stage of something. And so the price might be well controlled and the quality is going to be there generally, but it might take a lot longer than you would expect for something to happen.
mm.
I would say that that's the most common.
That's
Hmm.
great. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, this is, I think, a really great glimpse into Japanese suppliers and auditing and FDA inspections. Before we close, what would you like to leave the audience with?
Well, I would just say again, everybody in Japan is a human being, just like the rest of the world. But there are certainly aspects that you have to figure out, and by figuring out, you can save a lot of time and money and headaches, I think. And so, uh, finding resources on the ground here, working in a smarter way, more than just throwing money at the problem, is really, I think, helpful to have long-term, effective and profitable supplier relationships here. You get great quality from companies here, and so it's well worth it as long as you can structure things that way, I think.
Okay, awesome. Well, Derek, this was really helpful. I really appreciate you hopping on and sharing your insight. And for everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. If you would like to connect about project or resource needs, head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next time.